now I realized that I was not, I didn't have my camera on. Okay, so hopefully now everything works. We'll, we'll give it a few minutes to set up. So as I was saying, I'm in Lake Placid this week looking at the foliage change, so I actually don't have my multi-screen set up. As a result, I can't actually easily share a presentation, so I decided after 4 episodes that for this 5th episode, I just ask the audience's questions, see how it goes, and based on that, decide if that's the type of episode we should be doing on a regular basis or what the correct cadence is for these Ask Me Anything type sessions. Anyway, with this intro, apparently this works everywhere. Let me get the ball rolling. So, welcome to Playing with Episode. Start over. Welcome to Playing the Unicorns, Episode 5. This week, I'm covering everything or any questions you might have for me or any ideas you may want to pitch. Okay, we're getting a fair amount of questions already, so I'll put this view so you can also enjoy the beautiful Lake Placid view while we're at it. So the first question that I think is interesting is what's the impact of the antitrust laws and maybe regulation in general on tech and for the tech sector and for maybe for startups? And it's actually interesting because you can make an argument that goes both ways. On the one hand, allowing new startups to create competition for incumbents is actually a really good thing, and in a way, you could say that they've been stifled or can be stifled in certain categories. At the same time, if you don't do it intelligently, and if you also prevent like bolt-on acquisitions or acqui-hires, you actually can starve the entire venture ecosystem of capital. Because if you think of how the funnel works, obviously the entrepreneurs come up with the ideas, the angels start funding them, then the venture capitalists keep funding them, and eventually they need an exit. Now, a few get really big and can go public, but for the vast majority, the exit path is actually an acquisition, and usually by the larger tech companies. And so if that actually avenue goes away, be it the acqui-hires or the small acquisitions, etc., that would probably be really difficult and really catastrophic for the tech sector as a whole, and probably catastrophic for the US economy as a whole. Today, the tech sector is the only source of economic growth and productivity growth that is keeping the economy running in these dark times. And so it'd be great if we could have intelligent regulation, meaning don't allow existing incumbents to extend their dominance by acquiring people that are directly competitive, but do let them do bolt-on acquisitions, et cetera. Otherwise, you might risk destroying the entire ecosystem and, frankly, the underlying engine of economic growth. My concern is observing the different hearings where people are making political points rather than being thoughtful, so the regulation is going to be heavy-handed and not particularly smart or intelligent. And I'm particularly worried of things in terms that are onerous, right? If you tell tech companies they have to be responsible for their content, or you make it very difficult to abide by regulations, you're actually not helping competitors, you're actually entrenching the incumbents, because who has the money and the labor force to actually abide by regulations? Of course, it's the larger companies. It's a lot easier for Google or a Facebook to hire a lot of people to follow complex rules than it is for a startup. And so I tread very lightly, and I'd be very thoughtful from both a regulatory perspective and an antitrust perspective. Let me look at a few other questions. So Zach is asking me, is mentioning that we've been successful at FJ Labs, and I've been successful as an angel investor by making decisions really quickly, and is wondering why are VCs in the early stages wasting a lot of time with due diligence? Why are they and whether or not for FJ Labs has taking or external capital changed your processes. Now, the thing is, most people, when they raise external capital, they raise it from institutional investors. And these institutional investors have expectations. And part of these expectations is kind of a checklist, actually, often, is Do you do due diligence? Do you take a board seat? Also, most VCs have a rather concentrated portfolio. And so in their cases, they feel like they need to do this work. Often, to be honest, I feel that it's kind of like, I don't know if it's through a hoop, but it's just like crossing the T's, dotting the I's, and pretending to have done, real work, rather than actually elucidating or adding visibility in terms of why in terms of your decision-making process. If anything, often I find that the longer I take to make a decision, the worse my decision is. The first analysis, given the number of at-bats I've had, given that it's somewhat driven by both data and heuristics in addition to my intuition, works better. Clearly for us at FJ Labs, since we've taken external capital, there's a number of things we've changed. I mean, back in the day, before I started working with Jose and having FJ Labs, people would, after I'd commit into an investment, whatever the amount, 50K or 100K or 250K, I would actually not even bother to read the legal documents. I would auto-sign everything they ever sent me from the day of the investment all the way to the exit. And I wouldn't even read them, and I figured it had no impact. We now have a fiduciary duty to our LPs to make sure that we also cross our T's and dot our I's. So we now have an entire back office team. We actually read stock purchase agreements. We try to negotiate preemptive rights, provider rights, etc. We don't always get them, but we try to. And it made us a little bit slower. Obviously, we have such a large deal flow now that instead of being one meeting with me and we decide, usually it's filtered and there is a first meeting with a member of the team that writes a debrief, and then it leads to a second meeting with either Jose or I, or me, to decide what we do next. This changed. That said, we try to stay true to our focus, and I think ultimately it will probably limit the type of LPs we can have, because we don't want to have concentrated portfolios. We don't want to be on boards. We don't want to be competing with VCs. We want to be their friends. And it probably also limits the ultimate fund size. I don't expect FJ Labs to have a multi-billion-dollar fund anytime soon, if frankly ever, just because we would then be competing for allocation in the major VCs, which is not what we're trying to do. When Bessemer or Sequoia is writing a $5 or $6 or $7 or $10 million check, we're more than happy to write a $500K check. And that also means we're probably not leading, we're not setting the price, we're not taking board seats, etc. And that's totally fine by us. Okay, scroll down. So Joao is asking, how did I acquire the first customers at OLX? And maybe it's a more general question. If you're building a marketplace, do you start with the supply side or the demand side? Do you start with the sellers or the buyers? Now, in general, most marketplaces are demand constrained, because if you go to a supplier or a seller and you tell them, hey, I potentially have customers for you and I don't charge any listing fee, most of them are willing to do a test or be there. So when you're building your marketplace, you typically start, and that's true of 99% of marketplaces, they're demand constrained rather than supply constrained, you start with the supply side. And so that's exactly what we did at FJ Labs. We kind of had a sales team, and in the various major countries, we approached short to mid-tail sellers of like car dealers, real estate brokers, stores that had collectibles, and convinced them to list on OLX. And that was in 2006. We did that in a number of countries. And then we try to match the supply and demand by buying long-tail keywords in SEM. Now, there was a time where the competition for buying ads on Google and Facebook, et cetera, was a lot less sophisticated. And so most people were just buying, buy used car. And if you were buying, buy BMW X5 2005, 10,000 miles, yellow, because there's very little volume, no one was bidding for these, but the CPCs were a lot lower. And so we did that very effectively for many years. Obviously, we had a mix of SEO and other acquisition channels. Ultimately, in the long run, we did TV, but much, much later, once we had actually already reached capacity or scale in a few countries. Now, by having this approach, we were able to get traction in 4 countries, Brazil, India, Pakistan, and Portugal. And we tried 100 countries, to be clear. We spent about 50K, so not that much, in 100 countries. So it's 5 million total. It's only 50K per country. And that was enough to match supply and demand intelligently and to be successful. And so then we focused on these 4, became large and profitable, and then reuse that to expand to the other countries. And another thing we did, kind of a hack or a trick, is we were competing with like larger, sometimes publicly traded companies, be they eBay or Shipstead or Mercado Libre, who don't really have the same ethos and dynamism as a startup. And so they would bid on the short-term keywords like used car, and that's a very expensive keyword with a lot of volume. But they would put like in the evenings after 5 or 6 p.m. or in the weekends on Friday at 6 p.m., they wouldn't actually be bidding or monitoring what they were doing. And so they would say, okay, for the weekend, I put a budget on this keyword of whatever, $10,000, $5,000, $100,000, and they put a maximum they're willing to pay. And so we try to figure out when they were no longer paying attention, and then we would increase our bid on that short tail keyword. We actually would start bidding just then, increase it to 1 penny less than them. So they would actually be paying, instead of 10 cents a click, maybe $1 a click. Their budget would run out. The minute we'd be number one in the auction, we'd decrease our bid, and boom, we'd be number one on a short tail keyword at a very low CPC with no competition for the entire weekend and the entire night. And we did that for years, and companies like eBay or Shipstead, didn't figure, or Mercado Libre didn't pay attention and didn't figure it out. And so there's, when you think about it, when you're a startup, you have speed, you can be more aggressive, you can work harder than the incumbents. So they have more money, but they move slowly, and the people that are doing the work are not as embedded or wedded to the ultimate success. It's funny that they really never realize this. So Sergey Stupak, and I apologize if I'm completely butchering your name, is asking, what's the best advice to building a personal brand in VC, especially in junior roles? I'm seeing a lot of approaches. First of all, I don't know to what extent it matters or not, and in a way, asking me for VC advice is not the best, because I didn't come into VC. I never had the ambition of being a venture capitalist. I was always, first and foremost, a tech entrepreneur. I still see myself as a tech entrepreneur. And it just so happens that by virtue of being a consumer-facing internet CEO, a lot of people started asking for investments. And so I started investing in these startups. I thought it was interesting. It was value-added both for them and for me in my day job. It made me a better entrepreneur to see all the different trends. And so by 2013, once I left OLX, I'd already made over 100 investments. I'd already had many exits. It was very successful. And so ultimately, when I transitioned to being a VC in 2016, it was kind of a continuation of my existing efforts. So if you're a junior VC, I'd say try to be thoughtful and come up with theses and perspectives. I would probably publish these. I don't know, either if you have your own blog, you could do it there, or Medium, or maybe your fund or firm's site. Some people do podcasts, some people, there are different approaches, but frankly, at the end of the day, if you can source amazing deals, if you be super helpful to the entrepreneurs, I think it'll start through word of mouth coming out, and your deal flow will improve, and your ability to make decisions, given the number of bats you get, will improve as well. So not sure, obviously. I'm not doing playing with unicorns to build a brand. I think it's more like, and frankly, I really see this as quasi-altruism. It's like everything I wish I knew as a tech founder when I was 20, sadly 26 years ago at this point, that I now know, and try to break it down in like digestible tidbits that could be used, and that's why in some of the, while I already covered things like fundraising, in the upcoming episodes I want to cover things like how do we come up at FJ Labs with like business ideas, how do we evaluate these ideas, whether then good or bad, and many other such topics. So Leon is asking, what are the high leverage activities people should be working on? I assume by that you mean entrepreneurs in general. Look, I think the reality and the answer, frankly, to many of these things is it depends. What is most high leverage for your organization may be very different from someone else. Some organizations are driven by sales, in which case having a lot of meetings, creating a brand in your category as the leader might be the right play. If you're early in the life of your organization, you're trying to figure out find product market fit, talking to people about how you can do that best. If you don't actually know how to do that, might make the most sense. The life, and maybe I'll generalize, the life of the entrepreneur is one where we live with constraints. The constraints are how much capital we have, it's always limited, how much tech resources we have, it's always limited, and how much time we personally have, it's always limited. And so it says much about what you choose not to do than it is about what you choose to do. We are not in a position, given the limited resources we have, to be boiling the ocean. We have to make very deliberate choices. So you need to figure out what is the most high leverage activity in your business and allocate all your resources to that. And not try to do everything because it's not going to work. Now, in the process of doing that, you may do a lot of multivariate testing. You may do, throwing a lot of the spaghetti on the wall to see what sticks. But once you've actually figured out things that work, definitely focus on these things rather than trying to do a little bit of everything else. Joseph Rossello is asking if foreign startups can succeed in the U.S. and what is my experience in with foreign firms setting up here. Well, first of all, if you think of like the traction you can get these days, there are companies, especially in things like social media, where absolutely, right? Like gaming companies or TikTok. Think of TikTok as, if I'm not mistaken, a Chinese company, and they have extraordinary success in the U.S. from a traction perspective. Now, if you're in things like marketplaces or e-commerce that are transactional, obviously you need to be able to accept payments. Perhaps you need a certain level of logistics, etc. I've seen a number of companies either reincorporate in the US or create US entities and actually start getting a lot of traction. And I can think of a lot of the larger European players, companies like Klarna, who are coming to the US and being reasonably successful. And so it's absolutely doable. The question is, does it make sense? Is that where the best category is for you next? I don't think the US market is that complicated. In fact, if I have to choose where to launch, I would launch in the US and frankly ignore the rest of the world. Frankly, my main advice to US founders is don't go global. And the reason is when you're at 100 million in revenues in the US, it's easier to go from 100 to 200 than it is to go from 0 to 100 in the rest of the world. And that's usually true at $1 billion, it's usually true at 10 billion. And because the valuations are higher, you're usually in a position to go and acquire the other players if people launch, or the Summer Brothers created clones that actually make sense for you to acquire. That's really a better path than actually distracting yourself and trying to win abroad. If Uber had to do it again, I suspect that not launching all these countries and actually either buying Lyft when they had the option to, or killing them and focusing on that would probably have been more valuable to them than having basically wars globally that was distracting them from winning in the US. And that's the issue. If you're launching elsewhere, you're distracting yourself. So to answer your question, if you're a foreign player, should you enter the US? Well, maybe you should even launch in the US first if you can, if you have the capital and the wherewithal. And by the way, incorporating the US not all that hard, getting billing systems working not all that hard. If you're already successful in a country, could the US be your next country? Perhaps. Obviously, look at the competitive nature and dynamic. Make sure that your English skills are good enough that you're going to be able to attract American VCs and convince them. For many Europeans, though, it feels scary. And so after France, you go to Germany, or after Germany, you go to the UK, and you go pan-European. It may or may not make sense. I mean, part of the issue is a lot of the companies in the rest of the world usually are copying ideas from the US. And so that means there's an incumbent in the U.S. doing this, usually a lot larger and much further ahead. And so that said, if there's an idea that's innovative that you've come up with that's doing extraordinarily well in your market and it's not being done in the U.S., of course, if you can do it in the U.S., do it in the U.S. It's a much, much better market. So are we currently in a tech bubble? What's interesting is over the last, 15 years for sure, that question has kept popping up. And I think people don't understand what a tech bubble is. And I lived through the 98, 99, 2000 tech bubble. And that was a time where just on your pedigree, people would invest in you. And companies that had zero revenues, frankly, zero hope of revenues, were worth billions of dollars. It was a time where I remember receiving by fax binding term sheets from investors I never even talked to invest millions of dollars in my company. I mean, that's a bubble. That makes absolutely no economic sense in any way, shape, or form. Now, because interest rates are rather low right now, it's been inflating asset prices across the board, and tech prices especially, because we have been the creator of economic growth and productivity growth. And so valuations are frothy. perhaps not completely unjustified, given that this is where the economic growth is coming from. In a world of zero interest rates, the valuations you can justify are actually rather high. Now, should that change, there could be a reckoning and coming back to earth. So I guess I would say valuations are frothy, though we are not in a bubble. A bubble-like environments or ones where people expect things to never go down. There's a new paradigm. The old rules don't apply. Crypto a few years ago was definitely in that bucket. Real estate, of course, in the 07, 08 period, or 06, 07 period, and tech in the 98, 99, 2000 period. We're not there yet. Could we get there? Possibly. If interest rates stay too low too long, I suspect we might have an everything bubble, meaning every asset class will be overvalued. Fixed income or bonds, equities in general, and tech specifically. And so I could really well see all asset class being inflated because in a low interest rate environment where there's no inflation, I suspect that the inflation, it doesn't happen in the goods you buy on a day-to-day basis, partly because tech is actually deflationary and moving prices down, but actually it expresses itself, that inflation, in asset prices. And so we're seeing asset price inflation everywhere, and I expect that to continue, and as long as interest rates stay as low as they are, and as long as there's that much liquidity out there from a combination of quantitative easing, massive fiscal easing by all the governments around the world to fight this coming recession. Now, I don't expect inflation because there's been demand that's been very constrained, unemployment remains high, and we're on the verge of a massive wave of personal and small business bankruptcies, which is sad for those people facing it. But I could very well see asset price inflation and tech valuations remaining frothy for a time to go. So Samir is asking whether SaaS startups should be geographic agnostic or not. And the answer, as usual, is it depends, right? Like, how is your product sold? If your product, and who is it applicable to? The startups that I would recommend to go global, which is kind of the opposite of my original, recommendation, don't go global, or the startups where there's where it's user-generated content, where it's self-serve, where people can just buy your product immediately. So if you have an amazing product that people just want, it's true that buying ads nationally and actually globally is actually cheaper than buying ads in a very specific region. Now, if you're sold by a sales team that needs to be meeting decision makers in person, that's a very different answer. So in general, to the extent possible, it depends on the nature of your SaaS business or your marketplace. Buying ads nationally, great because it's cheaper, but there may be components of like you build more credibility and you have more liquidity in marketplaces if you're hyper local, and in the SaaS businesses, if you need to be doing sales meetings, and also if you sign one big client in a category, you can maybe sign other clients in this category. It may make sense to focus there. That said, if you have a self-serve product that anyone can use, why not make it available everywhere? So Genius Morty is asking, what are my thoughts on impact investing from a venture capital lens? Now, what's interesting is, and I'll even generalize it, like philanthropy versus impact investing versus being a traditional venture capitalist, and supposedly or notionally focusing on returns. And I guess it comes down to what is your underlying mission? Why are you doing what you're doing? And if I look at myself, the reason I'm a tech entrepreneur, the reason I like to invest in startups is because startups improve broken user experiences, so they create higher NPS experiences, and at the same time, because they're innately deflationary, they improve people's purchasing power. And so they decrease inequality of opportunity, they decrease social injustice, and they're better for humanity writ large. They think of poor Indian farmer with a smartphone today. He has more access to information than the president of the United States had 20 years ago to global communications. With WhatsApp video calls, he has free global communications, and with Wikipedia and Google in his pocket, he has access to the sum total of humanity's knowledge. It is absolutely game-changing, and these are the type of things we take for granted. But it's also true of most of the marketplaces we invest in. They remove bias because it's algorithms. Not to say algorithms cannot be biased. We're picking the best provider for you, regardless of race, gender, etc. And because they're cheaper, they allow people to buy more and have better experiences. Not to mention the user experiences in general are better. And so even though ultimately you're measured on returns because that shows whether or not you're having an impact in the sense that people are buying the product and liking it and are successful, the underlying mission, I think that many entrepreneurs are mission driven. They face a fundamental issue in their life and they intend to fix it. Like they felt they were discriminated against by the bank that was not giving them a loan, so they're creating a new loan product. There are a number of ways you can come up with ideas, but many people are fundamentally mission driven, and that's actually fantastic. And if I look at the reason we have the quality of life we have today in 2020 relative to, let's say, 220 years ago, where life expectancy was below 30 on average in the world, below 40 in every country in the world, where people worked 70 hours a week, 7 days a week to barely survive, 96% of humanity was in extreme poverty, is the technology revolution, or the productivity and the quality and the increases in wages and that have come through technology and technology being applied in the economy for the last 200 years, then I expect that to continue. And so inequality of outcome has fundamentally decreased. The quality of life we have today, especially in the West, would make the kings of yesteryear blush. Now, it's not to say that everything is for the best in the best of possible worlds. We still have fundamental gender and social injustice and inequality, especially inequality of opportunity. Our school systems kind of suck because we fund them through local property taxes, which entrenches inequality. Or our healthcare system is definitely doesn't serve the masses well. The public services are horrendously backwards. So there's a lot that needs to be done, but things have been moving in the correct direction, and tech is the main vector for doing that. And so I'm fundamentally optimistic that this is the main way to improve the world on a go forward basis. And in this time where we've lost faith in our politicians, I see the tech sector as the means of actually solving these problems. And by the way, the other fundamental problem that humanity is facing is climate change. It's an existential threat. And because it's kind of the fallacy of the commons, where everyone takes these public goods, whether it's the air or air quality, as given, and no one's making the global collective efforts to actually decrease our greenhouse gas emissions, I think it's going to have to come to tech. And the good news there is there's a lot of things coming down the pipe that will have fundamental impact. So if you look at the global greenhouse gas emissions, and they're basically split in four sectors. You have 25% coming from energy production, you have about 25% coming from agricultural production, you have 20% from manufacturing, and then you have 16% coming from transportation. And on all of these fronts, you're seeing massive improvements in technology in terms of solar is becoming cheaper every year, storage is becoming cheaper, so at some point we're going to be able to move all of our electricity production to solar and renewables. Already over half of the new capacity added is renewables, most of that is solar. It's already cheaper than other forms from a creation perspective, not yet storage, but we're getting there. And I'm going to give a speech on why I'm fundamentally optimistic at some point in the coming weeks on the future of humanity and our ability to change the fundamental problems we're facing. Same thing is happening in food production in terms of we're seeing progress in lab-grown meat to the point we can imagine having lower methane gas emissions from sheep and from cows in the future through a combination of a company like Mutual that will give you a feed that decreases the greenhouse gas emissions, or having lab-grown meat completely. Same is true in transport. We're rapidly electrifying all of the cars, and we're seeing not just efforts from Tesla, but all across the board. Now, should there be, or should you use social impact or do philanthropy? Perhaps. I use philanthropy slightly differently because my philanthropic efforts don't have the same level of leverage, right? So I pay for the education of 10,000 kids, K through 12, in Cabarete, in the Dominican Republic, and frankly in the Dominican Republic writ large, and that's fantastic, and it's game and life-changing for these 10,000 kids. But it doesn't impact the world with millions of lives or billions of lives being touched. And if I look at a company like the one I built, OLX, where we have 350 million unique visitors a month, we have millions of people making a living off the site. That actually changes, we're part of the fabric of society in many countries. And it changes the lives of many, many more people. And even though it's a for-profit entity, given that most of the services are free, it actually has more impact globally than my non-for-profit initiatives. But my non-for-profit initiatives change the lives of the people I help probably more dramatically than what technology does writ large. But this technology brought to across every different, or technology at large brought about every sector, every geography, etc., ultimately fundamentally transforms people's lives for the better. So Joao is asking which startups that failed before would succeed nowadays because of the timing of the market. Now, what's interesting is many of the startups that are successful today actually failed back in the day. So if you remember the 99-2000 period, Webvan failed in terms of being a local grocery store. And now we have Fresh Direct or Instacart. We had Pets.com that failed in terms of selling dog food and dog toys, etc., and accessories. And now you have Chewy, you have PetSmart, they're doing really well. And so actually a lot of the original ideas from the late 90s, like Cosmo for delivery, for instance, didn't work well in a world without smartphones where you had your GPS, etc., where you didn't have great integrated payment systems, now work and have changed. So I'd have to think through, obviously these examples from the late 90s have kind of all been done. I'd have to think through things that failed in the past decade that maybe the time has come for. But nothing comes to mind, but clearly that is true that many of the ideas that were actually fundamentally good, it's just the execution of them was not there, and you can make the unit economics work with the technology and the service providers of the time. Leon Lin, yes, he is saying, I guess, agreeing with me that GDPR is entrenching incumbents and hindering startups. Absolutely. I mean, that's my fundamental concern with these regulations. It's people are using them to appear to be doing something, or to appear, and some of I guess the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And very often they think, oh, we'll put these regulations, it'll make it harder for the incumbents, but really the only thing it does is it makes it hard for the startups, so the incumbents can always deal with the regulation. I wish regulators in general were smarter, but ultimately I've seen in every category regulators get co-opted. And so you saw it in the airline industry back in the day when it was an oligopolistic market. You see it in utilities. And so sadly, I'm not particularly hopeful that we're going to see smart regulation. And I'd like people to tread very lightly, because you want to let startups continue to disrupt the incumbents. You want startups to continue to be innovative, especially given it's kind of the last engine of economic growth in the world today. So Victoria's saying that some entrepreneurs are getting tired of the hunt for unicorns. Like, why does something need to be a unicorn? And the answer actually is things don't need to be unicorns. Most entrepreneurs are actually not venture-backed entrepreneurs. Most entrepreneurs around the world are small business entrepreneurs that are building restaurants, and they're building nail salons or hairdressers. So most people who are entrepreneurs are actually not building these unicorns. Now, if you want to be venture-backed and you want to raise tens of millions of dollars from VCs, then you kind of have to aspire to be a unicorn. Otherwise, it doesn't justify the capital that's invested. And so I'm not saying that these unicorn type startups or the chase for unicorn is the end all be all. Quite the contrary. It's very laudable, and most of the American economy, most of the jobs of the American economy are traditional small business entrepreneurs who are the lifeblood of the economy. And so, and most of them don't have the aspiration or ambition, or not building things that should be venture backed and will not be unicorns, and that's totally okay. But in the context of raising millions of dollars, then you need to have this aspiration. Otherwise, the economics don't work, because you need to remember most startups fail. The 5-year survival rate of a startup that has raised at least $500K in seed money is about 7%. And given that most startups fail, the ones survive need to pay for these losses. And the way to kind of make the math work is actually having in your portfolio some of these unicorns that pay for all the losses. In the case of FJ Labs, we're a little bit different because we're playing Moneyball rather than Powerball, and we make money on about 50% of the investments, but nonetheless, we still need companies to be in a position to create hundreds of millions of value, ideally, in order to pay for the ones that don't. So Biram is asking what experience we have in Africa and whether or not an M&A strategy would work to build a unicorn there. It's two separate questions, and I think I'll address the M&A one in general, not just in Africa. But in Africa, for a long time, we'd focus only in a few markets. For a long time, we focused on the U.S., on Western Europe. We focused on India and on Brazil. And these markets are large. They have not only angels, but they also have like VCs that'll fund every stage, and then they have exits. And so the problem with the other markets in general was that something was missing in the value chain. Maybe the A and B investors were not there. Maybe the exits were in there. And so if you were in Chile, for instance, there was this great initiative called Startup Chile to build startups there. The thing is, the domestic market was too small. There were no exits, and also you can get A/B funded. So yes, build your company there, but then the next recommendation is go to Brazil or go to the U.S. So those are okay, but not great. Now, there's been a fundamental democratization of the ability to create software. It's with open source, with the low code, no code revolution, it's cheaper than ever before to build startups, and we're seeing tech ecosystems emerge all around the world. We're seeing now not only in like Paris and Berlin and London, but we're seeing it in Nairobi. We're seeing it in Lagos. We're seeing it, frankly, in every major country because it's cheaper than ever before to build a startup. And so we started looking at, now that we have this explosion of creativity, this explosion of innovation coming from entrepreneurs from all around the world, what would be the next markets for us at FJ Labs after US, Western Europe and the Nordics, India and Brazil? And we started looking at the ones where we already had companies that were emerging, which usually leads to other companies doing well. So all of a sudden we had Rappi come out of Colombia, which is leading a lot of innovation there, and in Mexico. So we have Colombia and Mexico where we started investing a fair amount. And in Africa, there are especially, I guess, 3 markets where we're seeing a lot of innovation and where we started playing. And those are Nigeria, Kenya, because of the population in those respective countries, and South Africa, which was already reasonably rich. So in Kenya, for instance, we're investors in a company called Lorry Systems, which is a online freight forwarder. We looked at a number of companies in Nigeria. We almost invested in Trade Depot, which is a B2B grocery marketplace. We actually didn't pull the trigger, and we're actually now actively looking, but specifically in these 3 markets. Now, I guess in Southeast Asia, we're currently looking at Pakistan. We also, in the Middle East, we're looking at Egypt. So those would be the next level of countries, maybe Indonesia as well. So those would be the countries we would add that we will consider, perhaps even Malaysia. Now, in terms of is M&A or doing a roll-up a viable strategy, perhaps, but that's more of a private equity play than as a venture play. We mostly like to invest in companies that are scalable and can grow through a scalable acquisition channel rather than M&A. The M&A ones are typically much more capital inefficient. And so could you build one? Possibly. Wouldn't be the type of things we would necessarily get involved with, though. So on Twitch, Sanchez, perhaps, is asking, what's the best way to build VCs, a relationship with VCs, not because you want funding, because you're typically resourceful, informed, want to get a sense of what's going on. So junior VCs are more than happy to spend time with you, chit-chatting about the space and building relationships while waiting for your future round. And they typically hang out like at various tech meetups and tech conferences, et cetera. And frankly, you can even, especially the ones that are a bit more public, you can reach out to them. Very often, they will identify you. Right? The job of an associate VC in many companies is like find the fast-growing companies and start building a rapport and a relationship. So you can have these conversations, whether they're valuable to you or not. unclear. I don't usually spend any time fundraising absent the times where I am fundraising, because most VCs really just want to talk to you then. And so I prefer to just run very tight processes. It's like, okay, we're starting a process to fundraise. I'm going to talk to these 10 VCs this week, the next 10 VCs next week, try to get in line, that same, everything in sync in terms of when you get a partner meetings, when you get a term sheet. This way, everything's happening at the same time. The problem in the informal conversations is, should they lead, for instance, to a term sheet, you have nothing happening. You have no other competing bid. It may not be one you wanted. You're not going to be optimizing. You may end up allocating too much time to these conversations, and you're definitely not optimizing the process to maximize price. I think Charles has appreciated the way I was bidding for keywords on short tail keywords. Joyce is asking if that's Nikola Tesla on my t-shirt, and indeed it is. Back in the day, when Edison was probably just as famous, he was famously asked, what does it feel like to be the smartest person in the world? And I think his answer was, I don't know, ask Nikola Tesla. Tesla is amazing, and I love his story, though, of course, the story at the time between Westinghouse and Tesla and Edison is fascinating. To me, it's as fascinating these current wars as the battle between Microsoft and Apple, I guess the Wintel duo, so Microsoft, Intel, and Apple, and the PC versus Apple in the 80s and 90s was. Sebastian is asking, who thinks business lines is worth killing the trees? So I'll grant you that if you do an Excel model and you're predicting me your next 5 years, and you're telling me, what do you think your revenues are going to be in 5 years, I will not believe it. That said, you do need a deck to be able to pitch a story that's compelling, or at least to get in the door. In fact, often I need the deck to get you in the door, but once you're in the door, I'd rather have a conversation. And I do want you to think through what your revenues are going to be the next 12 months, and to have modeled them out, both top down and bottoms up. But obviously, do I believe that your 5-year model? No. But at least you need to have the right ambition, right? If your ambition is to go from 1 million revenues to 2 to 4 to 5 to 8, that's not a venture backable startup. It may be a lifestyle business, it may be a great business, but it's not venture backable. So understanding your ambitions is useful, and then having a sense of calibrating where you're going to go with the amount of money you're raising now. And I need to be able to assess whether it's enough for you to get in your next round, because all these companies are money losing. So the objective of your seed round is to get your A round. The objective of your A round is to get your B round. At some point, you get a profitability, and you can do this arbitrage in growth and profitability. But for now, I need to believe that your ambition will get you to the next round, and that you can execute. Victoria's asking what's my view on competition and the red blue ocean strategy. I would much rather face no competition. So Peter Thiel has mentioned that many times, that it's way better to be a monopoly and you get better economics. And there are many ways to do that. One way to do that is to go after a niche. And those niches may appear small at the outset, may end up being a lot larger. And the beauty of going after these niches is you face usually a lot lower competition. You face lower customer acquisition costs as a result of that. Your market share increases. And usually, once you dominate a category, you can find coin joint categories to attack. And that's why we like the vertical strategy. Of course, if you have to choose, I'd rather be the leader, or invest in the leader, or be building the leader in the horizontal category. You'd rather be eBay than TCG Player, which is a vertical Magic the Gathering marketplace. But if that position is already taken and there's an incumbent, and or if it requires too much capital to win, going in a vertical category where you can dominate the category with much less capital and build a multi-billion-dollar company is absolutely worthwhile. So I'd much rather go to places that are not too competitive. And even though competition is not usually what kills you, what kills a startup is more likely you didn't find product market fit, or you didn't have good unit economics, or you can find a scalable acquisition channel. So even though you have product market fit and good economics, you can't build a big company, or you fight with your co-founder. this is more likely to kill you. It's just more expensive to succeed in a world with a lot of competition, and it means that the ultimate returns may be lower. And so if you think you're going to win, it's fine, but if you can avoid competition, all the better. So find vertical approaches that are differentiated such that you're not facing too much competition. So Friday is asking, do I think nonprofits should be run as startups, or are they ripe for disruption? What's interesting is I think there are a few nonprofits out there doing really interesting things. So if I think of Endeavor, which is one of the organizations I fund, they actually have this, their main mission is helping entrepreneurs in emerging markets build larger companies because they create jobs, they create growth, and they're positive for humanity. And to become more sustainable, they've actually created a venture fund where they're investing in startups, and this way they can capture some of the upside of the companies they're helping build. And so models like that, I think, make a lot of sense, and I hope we see more of those in the future as well. What company would have I loved to found? Question by Thomas. What's interesting is, well, there are a lot of marketplaces out there that I wish I'd founded and could have kept running or improving. I guess starting with eBay and Craigslist back in the day. I've actually tried to I've built Craigslist type companies and eBay type companies around the world. I tried either buy or run Craigslist, not successfully, and I would have loved that. In the last decade, clearly the two marketplaces that would have been the most fun to build and run are probably Uber and Airbnb. Possibly Airbnb. Now, would I have been the right guy to run both? I'm not sure. Both are fighting entrenched incumbents, monopolies with the taxi industry and the hotel industry. Well, not necessarily monopolies in the case of the hotels, but definitely very well lobbied and regulated spaces, and you need to get permission from cities. I mean, they both decided to do a very famous startup strategy, which is ask for forgiveness rather than permission, which are exactly the type of things I would do. But then eventually you have to make right and make peace and with these regulators. And I think I would have hated doing that part of like making peace with regulations that to me make no sense. Like there should be no local taxi monopoly, and there's no reason Airbnb should be illegal. If they agree to pay a hotel tax, they should be allowed to operate anywhere, and that would actually is better for owners as it creates more inventory, it decreases hotel costs, is better for cities, but that's not the way regulation works. And so having conversations with regulators that I think are not particularly smart and don't have the best interests of humanity at heart is something that would grate upon me. And so I'm not sure, even though I wish I'd created them and I'd run them, I'm not sure I would have been the best person to do that. I think I would have been pretty good on the product side and fundraising, et cetera, but probably not so much on the dealing with regulators side. Can I hire someone to do it? Perhaps, though. At the same time, many of these people want the CEO they want to talk to the CEO. They want him to be the humble buy, and I'm not sure I would have been very good at that. But it would have been fun. It would have been a fun journey. Anthony's asking, will I build another venture in the future? And the answer is maybe. I actually built a company it's not well known, but in 2014, 2016, which was called Sellid, which I then merged with Wallapop. I became chairman of Wallapop in Spain and CEO of the US operations, and then ultimately merged it with OfferUp and LetGo. Well, LetGo first, then OfferUp, and so didn't stop running it. I'm open to doing that again. When I did that for 2 years, found a really effective way to still be involved with FJ Labs and make it work. The issue, and I actually would love to be an entrepreneur. The issue is more, do I find an idea that I think is large enough and compelling enough that it's worth doing? And the reason it may not happen is unless I thought it was going to be big from the get-go, I probably wouldn't do it. And many ideas, and many of the largest ideas, didn't seem that big in the early days. So Airbnb started as inflatable air mattresses in people's living rooms. That didn't seem like a very large idea. Uber started as black cars for rich people. Again, that didn't seem like a very big idea. Turns out they were much larger ideas, and you can expand upon them. And so if I found an idea that was super compelling, or if I was invited to run or join a company that I thought I could really create something really large, it'd be great. I have to find an intelligent way to make sure that the FJ Labs LPs are still happy with the fact that I'd be doing that, and I'm sure we can structure something intelligently. I guess all that to say, I'm open-minded. I think it would be fun if it happened, and if it didn't, that's totally fine too. FJ Labs is a startup in its own right. I mean, we didn't join a fund. Well, Jose and I are building a new fund, which entails a lot of things, and is interesting. Plus, every year, in a way, we are building one or two new startups de novo because of our startup studio model, and so we get involved in building these companies. And I'm not against, frankly, even running one of these in the future, should that make sense. And so it's I would like to do it. Whether it'll happen is unclear. If I find an idea that I feel is my mission to go and build, the way OLX was. OLX was the company I felt I was meant to build, and if I could have, I would not have sold it, but we needed the cash to compete with our competitor, and I felt the company would do better when it was allied with Naspers or Prosus, and actually that proved to be correct. So it was actually the right thing for the company to do to sell it, even though personally I would have liked to continue to be the sole or the founder or CEO, not sole because I had a partner, but to be the one making the strategic decisions on a go-forward basis. So Patrick is asking when I think of funding or financing with debt. Obviously, debt financing is great if you can get it, and if you, because it doesn't lead to dilution. Now, there are things that I think, and there are times where it's easier to get than not. It depends what you're using the debt for. So there are two main ways to get debt in venture capital. One is you just did an equity raise, and you have the SVBs of the world saying, well, you have 4 or 5 million in equity, therefore we can give you a 1 million line of credit. And that's one way to get it. It's okay. Allows you to get a little bit more leverage, though of course it increases the probability that if you can't repay it because you haven't raised the next round, it puts a lot of pressure upon you and increases your ability, your propensity to go under. The one thing I like to finance with debt the most is actually things more like inventory. So if you're selling a product, having debt to finance inventory makes a lot of sense. You don't want to be using equity for that. If you're buying homes, if you're open door, you want to be using a line of credit. If you're a rebag and you're selling bags and you need to buy them first, you want to be using a line of credit. And so if you're a SaaS business and you have monthly recurring revenue that's predictable, then you kind of look perhaps like a bond. You could also use that for these things. The problem is it takes scale to get there. So it's unlikely you get that up front. It's good, but once you can get it, either because you can prove that the repayment terms are good, that makes sense. Like many of the fintech companies or marketplaces, the companies that are lending, they don't lend from the equity investors like us give. They lend from the capital provided to them by third parties. So be it a hedge fund or a bank or high net worth individuals lending them at different rates. The path typically is as follows, by the way. You launch your company, you're doing reasonably well, and let's say you want to finance loans that you're giving, or you want to be financing your inventory. Most likely, banks will not lend you. And so you start with like high net worth individuals and you pay like 15% interest rate. Then perhaps you go to hedge funds and you start convincing these high net worth individuals you're not very risky, so you start paying like 12% interest rate. And eventually, once you get to scale and you can borrow 10 million or 50 million or 100 million, then you can borrow from banks, and then you pay whatever 6, 7, 8% interest rates. But you rarely start with a bank line of credit. You build credibility together. And in fact, at the very beginning, most likely you're using equity. So more likely than not, the first few million you raise, you're going to be using your part of the equity to buy the inventory, to finance the loans or whatever, to demonstrate that the credit worthiness. And then you can start borrowing from high net worth individuals, then from hedge funds, then eventually from banks. But if you could, obviously you would like to do that from the get-go, but the ability to do that is very limited. And so while that is amazing, usually it takes a while to get at the right terms. Is there a risk in jumping from an angel to a seed round, or is it just semantics? By Hub Financiero. Well, the way I'd consider the angel round is the pre-seed round. It's when you're the first $1 million, and there's usually a team, an MVP, a deck, maybe not even an MVP, and there's usually no VCs investing there. It's a collection of angels that are writing checks, and maybe there are a few pre-seed funds, like a 4 that are investing. There are not very many, so it might be like 20 angels writing 50K checks that leads to that round. The seed round, which is the round after that, comes usually 12 months later. The company has launched, they have more of a team, they're doing 150K a month in GMV if they're a marketplace, and they're raising 3 at 9. If I was an angel and I had enough capital and the company had actually executed on the plan from angel to seed, I would totally invest in the seed. There's no risk there per se. If anything, the company is de-risked. You're paying a higher price because it's de-risked. That said, if you have to choose, and by the way, many companies are not going to make it there. Many companies are not going to raise their seed round. Many are going to have died. And so perhaps the ones that have made it, you do want to back. That said, if you have to choose between reinvesting in a few of these or having a more diversified portfolio, the math suggests that having a more diversified portfolio makes more sense. So as an angel investor, if you have more than 100 investments, you're going to do really well. If you have more than 500 investments, you're going to do really, really well. And probably 50 is on the low end of enough diversification where you're going to be able to be successful. So I'd have it, if you're investing that early, given the high failure rate, you want a really diversified portfolio, especially given the power law in venture. So looking at the upcoming questions, do I subscribe to the Y Combinator model? That user and revenue growth should be the core focus. And I guess I'd give you two questions, like, is there value in things like YC? Well, lucky you're in luck. That is actually my topic for next week, which is, should you build a company on your own as a first-time founder? Should you join an accelerator or incubator? Or should you be part of a venture studio? And I'll go through the pros and cons of all three. YC definitely has value in the incubator accelerator model in terms, especially if you're a foreign founder, they'll increase your valuation or access to capital dramatically. And if you're a B2B SaaS startup targeting startups, their network is so powerful, I would definitely try to get in. And I think Brex, for instance, the founder, would definitely say he funnily benefited from being able to sell to the other startups in YC and in their entire portfolio. But there are pros and cons. Now, should you focus on user and revenue growth for your seed round? Absolutely, right? Like your angel round, the million, is actually so you can find product market fit, and by the time you get your seed round, we expect you to have gone in the marketplace space to, let's say, 150K a month in GMV, taking 15%. In the SaaS space, maybe 30 or 40K a month in MRR. In e-commerce space, maybe same thing, 150K a month in revenues. And if you didn't find a scalable customer acquisition channel, if you didn't get to that level of scale, perhaps you're not ready for a seed round. And so and growth matters because we expect you to be able to kind of 4x from there for your A round. And so the growth rate you have matters dramatically because you need to be able to get there. So I apologize to people who will be listening to this on iTunes and Spotify as I'm reading questions, which is creating moments of silence, but this is continuing. So Charles asking what philosophies I had when I started this journey that worked for me then that perhaps no longer work today, and which ones have continued to be true. I'm trying to think through whether they're philosophies that I had that worked then that no longer work today, but there are definitely a number of underlying philosophies that I think continue to work to this day. The first one is to frankly take risks and chances because you're taking less of a risk than you think. So being an entrepreneur, for instance, most people would say, oh my God, that's crazy. There's your 5-year survival rate is 7%. You're more than likely than not to fail and or to go under. The thing is, what does failing and or going under mean, and what are the consequences? And for many of the people that are founders, the reality is they went to great schools. They used to have great jobs, be it at McKinsey or a bank, or they worked at a startup. Should they fail, they can always go back to these jobs. They will land on their feet. And so the risk that we are taking and they are taking is actually smaller than it is perceived. And most people are risk averse, right? And I am probably going to do a Playing with Unicorns episode on risk aversion, where if you ask people, what's your preference between 50% probability of getting $200 and 50% probability of getting 0 versus getting a sure 100, almost everyone wants a sure 100. And you kind of need to have, even though the expected value is the same. And so you need to kind of have an expected value that's much greater, maybe 50% of $300 and 50% of zero, for people to be willing to take that chance over the sure thing. And that risk aversion is true kind of across the board. And so if you take marginally more risk, you're highly rewarded for it in society. And so taking that chance is highly rewarding. Not to mention, I think it's highly rewarding not just financially, it's highly rewarding in terms of doing the things you'd rather be doing. And so most people fear failure. I guess the general bucket number one, be more comfortable with risk. And now, of course, I'm not sure why. I'd have to think through what the correct story is going to be on the risk side, because I also love heli skiing and kite surfing and ice climbing and car racing. And so perhaps I don't know which came first. Well, I was always entrepreneurial, but I also liked risk, or didn't have the same, I had a much higher risk tolerance than most to begin with. And so can you build it or not? I have to think through what the correct answer is. But be more tolerant of risk, number one. Number two, be comfortable with failure. People are afraid of failing, and I would argue that I failed my way to success. My first company, in a way, failed, and I failed personally and publicly in a massive way. And it was okay. I learned a lot, landed on my feet, and was able to do it again. And it's both failure at a big level, like I essentially went bankrupt, but it's also failure at a little level. Like most decisions you make as an entrepreneur are going to be wrong. You're going to pick the wrong business model. You're going to pick the wrong design. And so we multivariate test a lot of things. So have the humility to think through. You don't know everything, and just try and see what the correct answer is. And disruptive product change often is this sum total of 1% innovation or improvements done over and over and over again. And so be comfortable with failure at both the micro level and the macro level. And if you take the right lessons from it, obviously the objective should not be failure, but you have to be comfortable with it. You will actually ultimately do well. And most people's that are extremely successful, you only see the successes, but it's like crazy ups and downs. It's never a continuous straight line. I mean, look at Elon, who with Tesla almost went bankrupt a few times. He had to leverage all of his personal assets. He had to start sleeping in people's couches. And, I'm not necessarily want to put myself in the same bucket, but I, essentially failed with my first company. I had to live in New York, sleeping in the office at the couch at the office, like living at $2 a day in the city. And but you learn a lot and you grow through these experiences. So be comfortable with failure. As I said, you will fail yourself to success. You can't. It's very rare that you just immediately succeed, and if you do, it may be due to luck, and that will lead to bad decisions and bad habits. And in fact, if I had been as successful as I'd expected to be in my first startup, I would have been an arrogant, insufferable, kid, and probably would have led to my downfall. And so, eating a massive piece of humble pie and realizing that I didn't know everything, and actually was human and could fail, was actually a very useful life lesson to have at the age of 25 or 26, because at that point in time, I never failed at anything in life. I'm sure there are other philosophies, but in the interest of time, I'll move on to the next questions. How do I see the Euro USD behave in the next 24 months? It's a macro question, really driven by both a combination of interest rate expectations and financial and how aggressive from a fiscal perspective the different countries are going to be, and what the inflationary expectations are going to be. The reason the euro has strengthened dramatically in the last 3 months is that the U.S., the Fed essentially announced that we're going to be at zero interest rates for a long time, that it's going to be targeting slightly higher than 2% inflation in the foreseeable future, and the stimulus has been large, and there's an expectation at some point of a subsequent one, and the expectation is that will be truer in the U.S. than in Europe, where there needs to be more coordination. Now, what it'll be into the next few years is what the policymakers essentially decide in terms of fiscal easement and interest rate policy. And so who knows? I don't really pay attention to it. I don't care all that much. The way I think about these things is, what is my life cost structure in? In my case, is dollars. And And so when I get euro exits, I convert the euros to dollars, and it's good to be in the core currency that your costs and expenses are in. I don't spend that much time. I don't necessarily hedge the positions, etc. I've done it in the past, but it depends. And sometimes and the problem in my world is you don't know when the exits come, so you can't actually time the hedging very well. We have a company in Brazil right now that's going public, and we're doing I think a 35x return or so. Had the real not divided by 3 over that time period since we invested, it would have been a 100x return. The problem is when I invested, I had no idea that the exit would be today, 6 years down the path. So hedging for that is not really possible. But it's okay. I mean, we're going to do amazingly well regardless. And I can take I don't take that much consideration the macro environment as a whole, so I'll take a step back. Do I care about the macro environment? And for the most part, the answer is no, because the macro environment is today's macro environment. The macro environment that I care about is the macro environment when I sell in the future, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years later, when the startup is at scale. And no one can predict what that will look like. Now, there's some countries that are making decisions that are so bad that it looks like you should probably avoid them for the next decade. And that's why we moved away from Russia and we moved away from Turkey about a decade ago, and we, for a while, decreased our investments in Brazil. But when you're investing in the U.S., even though right now we're in a difficult recession and economic time, it doesn't prevent us from investing. If anything, it's actually an amazing creator of innovation and productivity. And so if I look at the most interesting companies that were built in the last decade, all of them were created in the 08-09 crisis. So Uber, Slack, WhatsApp, Airbnb. I expect the same to be true in the next decade. Many of the companies that are going to be defining that decade will have been created in 2020, 2021, or maybe even 2019, but will have lived through the crisis in a way that will be transforming for them and will be completely game-changing, and they will be the defining companies of the next decade. So the current macro environment, obviously has negative impact on people's lives, or maybe makes it harder to raise money, but doesn't really impact your ultimate investment decision. What matters is the macro in 5-10 years, and who knows what that's going to be. So Genius Morty, I guess, so we're replying to the question for before, everything is impact investing. I'm not sure everything writ large, right? If you're investing in shale oil or building a nuclear power plant, probably not. But in venture, I'd say most things are impact investing because they are deflationary and trying to improve people's user experiences. And so, yeah, I'd say that's a reasonably fair statement. Igor's asking, which investment gave me the best return and why? Now, the question there, it's funny because there are many definitions of best return. Best return could be the most money I made or the highest multiple. And those are two very different answers. So the most absolute dollars I made was probably Alibaba. I made a reasonably late stage investment, and Alibaba had a 15 billion valuation. I wrote $1 million check. It was like $4 a share, made like $20 million out of that. And on a multiple level, and I will immediately admit that this had nothing to do with skill, it was all luck. I invested in a Turkish mobile gaming company called Gram Games. And I invested because one analyst that had just joined us knew the team from Booth, said they were amazing, and said we should invest. And it was his first deal, and we're like, okay, it's really out of scope for us. We usually write 500K checks. Maybe I'll write a 50K check. And their premise was Clash of Clans, which is this game built by Supercell, is doing really well on iPhone, wasn't yet on Android, wasn't yet in emerging markets. They would do Clash of Clans types games for emerging markets on Android. And that was, I have to admit, a total disaster. The underlying premise of our investment failed. The games did okay, but nothing took off. And we kind of were like, okay, we're gonna shut down the company. We're gonna liquidate it. And for fun, one of them, their engineers, had built this little casual game called 1010, kind of like a math game. I don't know if you guys ever played the 2048, where it's like 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, etc. So it's one of those games, and instantly super successful. And I think they realized, well, maybe instead of trying to build these complex games where you need storytelling, perhaps voice acting, and complex development, let's build these casual games. And now that we seem to understand how to make them and to make them work, and they became a very successful casual gaming company to the point they got to tens of millions of profits a year. And Zynga bought them a few years ago for 250 million plus an earnout. And I think the 50K is going to be at the end of the day with the earnout like 8 million or something like that. So it's 130x or 140x, but invested a small amount in a geography where I don't invest that much anymore. I used to invest before Erdogan became president of Turkey, in a category I don't really invest in a thesis that failed, and we really got lucky. They pivoted and became very successful, and it was my highest multiple ever, probably the highest IRR. Well, maybe not the highest IRR, but definitely the highest multiple. And you do well. So there's a fair amount of serendipity and luck in these things, and that was super fun. Carolina is asking if I should invest in Bitcoin. So let's walk through the use case for Bitcoin, right? So Bitcoin, the I'd say Bitcoin, the equivalent, the best way to explain it is probably it's digital gold. It's a store of value. So it's not actually a currency. And the reason it's not a currency is it's actually complex to trade, and it's deflationary in nature because they're issuing fewer and fewer as even though demand is going up. And as a result, it's not really a great means of exchange. But it's a good store of value because it's deflationary. And if you live in a country that in the past has, let's say, arbitrarily confiscated your assets, or that is suffering from hyperinflation, or where there's a risk that they will take your assets away from you in general, it actually makes sense to hold Bitcoin. So if you were in Argentina, obviously Bitcoin didn't exist in 2000, but you've seen over the last 20 years periods of high inflation, confiscation of the retirement assets. You've seen the pezification of your dollars. If you were in Venezuela, if you were in Zimbabwe with crazy inflation. So the alternative you could have is you could buy diamonds, or you could buy gold, but they can be stolen away from you. Not that cryptocurrency cannot be stolen away from you. They're hard to keep safely. And so having things like Bitcoin makes a lot of sense. Now, if you live in a country like the US, where you have access to banks and a financial system where it's reasonably trustworthy, you have access to other asset class, do you want it as part of your overall portfolio of investments? Perhaps as a small percentage. It's a hedge against fiat currencies devaluating, given that countries have been printing a lot of money. It's definitely possible that it happens. It's also, but like gold, it doesn't generate interest, right? It doesn't generate income. And so my general preference when I buy assets is for them to be yielding, to be creating something. So if I'm investing in a startup, it's creating value through the fact that startup is ultimately growing, getting revenues, providing value to humanity. Or if you invest in other assets, they pay rent, or they pay dividends, or they pay interest payments. And for the way these assets, the value is calculated is it's net present value of discounted cash flows in the future. With Bitcoin, and like with gold, that's not true. It's more supply and demand. Do people want that, value that asset class? It's also true of things like art or sports cars that are collectibles. And so I try to avoid these for the most part. If you have concerns with fiat currency, maybe having some as a hedge makes sense. Does it make sense for most people? Probably, perhaps not, though it's easier than ever to buy and trade with things like Coinbase. Do I think the guy in the t-shirt will continue to have his stock rising? Well, the guy in the t-shirt is actually Nikola Tesla, who had an amazing life but is no longer sadly with us. Do I think the Tesla stock will continue rising? To be honest, I do not follow public markets at all. I have zero investments in stocks. Usually when one of the companies I'm an investor in goes public, I sell because I'd rather be playing in the private part. So I have no perspective on stock markets as a whole, and I have even less perspective on specific stocks like Tesla, Amazon, Google, Apple, Alibaba, etc. I just don't follow it. It's not my area of expertise. I don't really allocate cycles to it, so I can't comment intelligently. What I have done is a completely non-traditional investment strategy for my wealth management. I don't own bonds. I don't, real estate I consider to be consumption in my case. It's like a place that I live in. It's not meant to be generating either value or income. And so it's really a bunch of cash as a hedge, or to have ability to be able to deploy it when and when I see investment opportunities that are great, either in times of crises or normally when it comes to startups, and a whole bunch of tech startup investments. And literally that's it. So it's a kind of a barbell portfolio of the type that probably Nassim Taleb would like, and doesn't have any of the traditional portfolio construction that people have. So cannot comment on the stock market, be it Tesla or others. Now, is Tesla leading the way to a combination of electrification and autonomy? Absolutely. I suspect that the value of Tesla is probably driven more by ultimately autonomy and self-driving than electrification, which is more commodity. But I can't comment. I don't even know how much they're worth, and so I can't comment on valuation. But I do like for the products they make, and I like the fact that I think Elon's goal or role in this world is to accelerate trends. So a lot of the things he's doing would have happened anyway, but they're happening a lot better, a lot faster, and I think that's actually a massive net positive for humanity, both on the space exploration or things like the Boring Company or Tesla. So I'm a fan, and I hope he keeps doing amazing things. I hope his companies survive, which is not a given, especially in the case of Tesla, because I do think things would be moving slower if it wasn't for them. Reading more questions. Paul Graham says founders should learn to code. Advise against it in your video. What do you think of this approach? So I understand. Look, if you know how to code, it's better, and it makes you a better. It's going to make you a better product CEO, and it's going to make you a better manager of tech resources, because you're going to understand what's hard and what's easy. And so when you do your allocation of resources and you pick the projects to build, you're going to make much better educated decisions. But should you be building your own MVP versus should you be allocating your time to finding product market fit, thinking through the best acquisition strategies, etc.? I would say the latter. There are a few exceptions, right? It kind of also depends on the business you're going after. The businesses I have a tendency to go build and invest in are businesses or marketplaces, and the key success factor in these marketplaces is actually finding product market fit, finding positive unit economics, and finding scalable customer acquisition channels. And so allocating your time to doing that is more valuable than building the MVP and learning to code. That said, if you have the time, and it's obviously better, it will make you a better CEO and a better allocator of resources on the tech side, I guess, when you're making these tech decisions. A long time since Quarante Sept Rue Spontigny. Indeed, I don't know who that is, but it has been a long time, and I did love spending time there as a kid in Nice. When are you? Sorry, I'm mumbling to myself as I'm reading different questions. I'm not sure I understand this one, so skip for that. Overrated or underrated? Using pair metrics for measuring KPIs, so setting two goals to measure something rather than one. The question, the issue with KPIs is you need to be in OKRs is you need to be very thoughtful about the ones that you set, because otherwise your team, especially if you incentivize people against them, you may end up with the wrong structure or the wrong outcomes because you put the wrong variable. So if you tell people you're focusing on growth and only on growth, then you may get a lot of sales that may be not profitable. If you focus purely on profits, you may not get the growth you need. And so being very thoughtful about the correct KPI or OKR really matters. For instance, if it's only NPS, you could create a delightful user experience, but it may not scale and it may not work. So I guess the answer is it depends. Most companies do manage to not one single metric, but multiple metrics. And there are a few exceptions, right? Like in March of this year, when it looked like the world might be ending, for most startups, there was only one KPI that started mattering. If you at the scale is be profitable, so you are a master of your own destiny, and if you're small, is extend your runway. So it's like cut your burn as much as you can in order to make sure you survive. And And so these moments of crises might lead you to have a single KPI. In general, most of the companies that we invest in have tracked multiple KPIs and incentivize people multiple KPIs and OKRs because we want to make sure that you get a balance of growth and profitability and unit economics and user experience, and then you focus on the ones where you're doing less well if need be. So I'd say for most people, you're measuring multiple things. Now, that's true for the company as a whole. So if you're looking at you're setting like global objectives for next quarter, next year, et cetera. For specific teams, though, you may be focusing on a very specific objective. So if I'm doing a funnel analysis, the from visitor to purchase, so the conversion funnel matters most. Then there may be a team with sole task is that conversion funnel and optimizing that. Maybe if you have 3 shorter pages instead of 1 long pages, long page, you have a higher conversion rate. So I'd say for the company as a whole, you probably have a number of KPIs. For specific teams, you may have one very specific one that and once you've done that, you go to another one. Someone's asking if I see different approaches between European VCs and French and European ones and US ones. The problem is we're not a very traditional VC, and so I'm not sure. I'd say in general, the consensus seems to be, and I'm going to say what the consensus is, that American VCs are willing to put more capital earlier with fewer proof points to go after growth, and European VCs probably invest less capital at somewhat lower valuations. But I don't actually have the data to back it up to see if that's true or if it used to be true. Is it still true today? I'm not sure. There's definitely been more capital and amazing VCs and amazing investments coming out of Europe of late. So perhaps it's true. I'm not sure. I guess the answer is I don't know. VCs want to invest, so that's Samir, in global companies, but preferably locally. Isn't that unfair to other economies, ecosystems, and ventures? The reason that is, by the way, is VCs live in reasonably concentrated areas. So let's say the Bay Area in San Francisco or New York, and most of them are making concentrated bets in a few companies. So when they invest, they're going to be on your board. They're going to spend a lot of time with you. And so if you are close to them, you make it easy for them to be on that, to make that decision. If you're based, let's say, in Miami, or if you're in another country or geography and you're far from them, they need to think through, is this investment worth it enough for me that I'm going to change my quality of life, which is rather good, working my job in Silicon Valley, and get myself in a plane 5-6 times a year to go to board meetings? Is it worth it? And so for many investments, the answer is no. And by the way, if you put yourself in a city that's not the core cities, it's actually usually harder to get sales. It's harder to attract talent. You may not have the density of talent. You may not be surrounded by other amazing people, and so you may not have this like crazy serendipity of amazing ideas having sex with each other. So is it fair? Probably not, but it makes a huge difference. And so to the extent possible, I would say base yourself in these core geographies where the VCs are, right? If you're in France, if you're in Paris, you're going to have a much easier time raising venture capital than if you're in Nice, my hometown. If you're in the UK, you're better off being in London. If in Germany, you probably are better off in Berlin. And that's true in most of these countries. And it's just the way that business works. And so it's okay to start from wherever you can start from it wherever. I mean, as I said, the open source and low code and no code revolution has made it much easier and cheaper to build companies. And we're seeing actually companies emerge from everywhere. But ultimately, if you want to be raising venture capital, you need to be where the venture capital is. And it happens to be in the larger ecosystems and the larger countries in the major cities. And so I would definitely move there, because VCs are not going to be coming to you. You're creating more barriers for yourself by asking them to do things they're not used to, and in changing their behavior patterns. So if you're ready to fall in their workflow, much, much better. Hi from Nice, Sebastien. Let's see if we have any more questions. So Alex Varman is asking, and hi by the way, is asking whether or not my university education at Princeton was useful. So there's a perhaps a raging debate like how useful is a college education, and there's becoming a consensus, or for many people, it's actually overrated. It's too expensive relative to what you get out of it. I'd say if you can get in the very best schools, right? Harvard, Stanford, Princeton, etc., it's still worth it. It's extraordinarily expensive. Maybe you leave with that, but the doors that it opens, the opportunities you get out of it are completely worth it. The issue is more for the schools in the middle, right? So if you're in a school that's ranked like 50 or 100, is it worth spending that much capital there? Perhaps not. Now, when you look at like, and I guess what Peter Thiel has been doing with the 20 under 20 and like helping people build companies without going to college, I think it's misunderstood. I don't think he's saying no one should go to college. By the way, like I think he's saying there's a very small subset of humans who are really smart. They probably could have gotten their PhD at 15. You know, they're self-taught. They're hardworking. They're motivated. They really are like the top 0.01% of like ambition, passion, intelligence, and can they become entrepreneurs without going and getting a normal college education? And the answer is absolutely yes. Chances are I could have built a startup company without college from a underlying skill set perspective. Now, that said, do I like a traditional liberal arts education? Absolutely. I think it gives you, if you are curious, you can learn a little bit of everything about anything. And I took classes in everything from like Russian literature to Mandarin to the Peloponnesian War and the Roman Empire. I took molecular biology and like classes and everything, and I loved it. And is it particularly useful in life? Probably not. Does it make me a better entrepreneur to know a lot about a lot of topics or to aspire to be a polymath or a Renaissance man? Probably not, actually. Many of the very best entrepreneurs are single-mindedly focused on their startup, and they know their category extremely well, and they know very little else. It doesn't make them succeed less. Perhaps it makes them less interesting human beings, but it doesn't make them less successful. And so, probably not for everyone. There are some people for whom it is a waste. Now, that said, I would really think through, if you're not in a position to get in the very best schools, does it really make sense to go to a middling college versus alternatives and forms of online education that are emerging? I think that the answer is probably not. And we're going to see a massive wave of failures of schools in the middle that are too expensive relative to the value they provide. And we're going to see massive disruption in online education where you're going to see either lower cost alternatives that provide a good enough education becoming available, and of course, at the high end, you're going to retain the Ivy League schools. The schools in the middle are probably going to suffer, and rightly so. I don't think they're delivering value for money, and things have to change from that perspective. Charles asking, would I consider myself quite open? What else would we say? Open and creative. I think this show is probably the reflection of that. I have a tendency, I believe in radical honesty and transparency and like seeing things as I see them, and that's true in my personal and professional life. I like sharing. Partly, I'm not sure why. I think it helps clarify and structure my thoughts. I like helping people. I've always seen me as kind of that professor type in terms of like sharing best practices, and so I am open. Though, funnily enough, historically I used to be really shy and introverted. How do I stay creative? I'd say there are a lot of ways, right? Like you meet, I like to surround myself and interact with a lot of interesting people. I host these intellectual salons. I read a lot. I read 50 to 100 books a year. Now, mind you, many of them are things like sci-fi and fantasy, etc., and some were also nonfiction, but it's probably a 70-30 split in favor of fiction and in the trashy, maybe not trashy, but like, sci-fi, soap opera, etc. genre, and 30% fiction. And I've dabbled in psychedelics, but I'm not sure that makes me more creative. I think these were interesting experiences more than anything else, and I do them once in a while. No, I think it's like keeping an open mind, meeting lots of interesting people, reading a lot of interesting things, and questioning the why and even personal beliefs. Like just staying open and curious. I guess curiosity has always been an underlying driver, and why be open? I think because it actually helps refine thought processes, meet other interesting people, be challenged, etc. And Laurence is asking, have I watched The Social Dilemma, and so what are my thoughts about it? So I have not watched The Social Dilemma. I do watch some TV shows, but very selectively. Like it used to be IMDb over 8, and in a genre where I need to be in the mood for them. I guess these days I'm watching The Boys, for instance, and there are a few other shows that I would recommend. Now, the reason I don't find the social dilemma, and I've read what the premise is about, and I've had summaries of it, super compelling. Is every time a new medium has come along, it's been highly criticized for corrupting the values of our youth. So when the bicycle was first introduced, for instance, and I encourage you to research that, people were saying, oh, it's giving women freedom to basically misbehave. It's creating and the bicycle was actually seen as a sin and an evil that was going to corrupt the morals of young women because they had the freedom to go away and perhaps express their sexual identity somewhere or somehow. People thought it was extremely dangerous to do it. When the book was invented, people thought the same thing. When TV was invented, people thought the same thing. When radio came along, people thought the same thing. When new music genres like rock and roll, people thought the same thing. It's like corrupting our morals and identity and disrupting or disrupting the political genre and system. And it always feels like it's like the older generation looking at the younger one and not understanding or feeling that the quality of life and morality has been fundamentally changed. And so I suspect people are feeling the same way about social networks today as other elderly people felt about TV or radio and the print or the books or frankly even the bicycle in the past. So I am way less critical and way more open-minded about not just the ills, and of course it's possible to be addicted to social media, to be addicted to games or technology, etc., but also about their benefits and the ability to stay in touch and the ability the ability to communicate or organize, etc. And I find that a lot of these documentaries on Netflix come in with a specific viewpoint. They're not objective, and so while I'm happy to watch them occasionally, I always try to research like the underlying research. But the one on the bicycle is really funny. I feel like look at all the articles that came out when the bicycles were released. It basically is exactly the same story that I'm seeing about like the ills of social media today. And I guess they mentioned in the documentary. I think we've it's quite the episode. I answered a lot of questions on a lot of different topics, and so this was great. I'm going to end it there. Thank you all for watching and participating. And if you're on YouTube and you see this X post, so, subscribe, put a comment, and definitely if you have ideas or suggestions for upcoming episodes, that'd be great. And like it if you like it. And I look forward to seeing you next week. Next week, I'll probably be covering as a first-time entrepreneur. Should you build a company on your own? Should you join an accelerator or incubator a la Y Combinator? Or should you be in a studio a la FJ Labs or others? And what are the pros and cons of the different approaches? And we'll take it from there. Let's see if I can find how to end this. Coming soon. I don't have my Elgato Stream Deck, so I actually can't find the this is over. Aha.